people looked at my life from the outside, they often said I was lucky. I had a loving husband, Jacob, a beautiful home with sunlit windows and a garden I tended every weekend, and a position as co-owner of our growing design company. We had started it together from scratch, just the two of us at a small desk in a rented space, dreaming about what it could become. In those early days, Jacob worked on client relations while I handled the creative side and the operations. We celebrated every new contract like it was a small miracle. I thought we were building not just a business, but a life together. Even now, I can still picture the mornings when Jacob would leave a cup of coffee on my desk before heading to a meeting, or the nights we stayed up late, talking about expansion plans and laughing about the mistakes we made along the way. Those memories were real, and I clung to them because they made me believe we were a team, unshakable, equal, and inseparable. But then, small things began to shift. At first, they seemed harmless. A meeting scheduled without me because it's just a quick discussion. A client dinner Jacob attended alone because it's too last minute to arrange for both of us. I told myself it was nothing, that we both needed to divide and conquer. That's what partnerships were about. Then came Anna. She was introduced as a consultant to help modernize our workflow. She was polished, with a smile that managed to be warm and calculating at the same time. I remember thinking she seemed competent, someone who could bring fresh ideas. She started joining meetings, offering suggestions, and staying late with Jacob to wrap up paperwork. I didn't mind at first. Any help was good help, right? But slowly her presence began to stretch into places it didn't belong. One afternoon, I walked into the conference room for a project briefing, only to find the chairs full and the presentation already underway. Anna was at the front, confidently discussing our company's future plans, with Jacob sitting in the corner, nodding. No one had told me the meeting time had been moved earlier. When I quietly took a seat, Anna barely acknowledged me. That evening, I asked Jacob why I wasn't informed. He laughed it off. It was just a casual talk, nothing important, he said, then changed the subject to a dinner we had been invited to. I let it go, but something inside me shifted. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more of these casual talks happening without me. Anna began to answer questions that clients directed toward me, as if she already held the authority. She started forwarding important emails to Jacob instead of me, always with a polite explanation. I thought it might be more efficient this way. I told myself I was overreacting. After all, Jacob was still my husband. He still kissed my cheek in the morning, still asked how my day was. But the words felt lighter now, as though they were spoken out of habit rather than love. One Friday evening, I stayed late to finish a proposal. From my office window, I could see Jacob and Anna in the parking lot, standing close, talking in low voices. I watched as she touched his arm lightly, laughing at something he said. He didn't pull away. They didn't notice me watching. I told myself it could still be innocent, that maybe they were discussing work, that maybe she was just that kind of person, overly familiar. But deep down, a quiet unease had started to grow. Still, I smiled. I went home and cooked dinner. I asked Jacob about his day, and he told me about a productive meeting with a client. He didn't mention Anna, and I didn't mention what I had seen, because I had learned something in business, and now, perhaps in marriage too. Sometimes you don't confront right away. Sometimes you wait, you watch, and you gather all the pieces until the picture is clear. At that moment, I didn't yet know how much the picture would change, or how far they were willing to go to push me out. But I was starting to understand one thing. Being underestimated could be the most powerful advantage I had. It was a Tuesday morning when I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The corridors were still quiet, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the pantry. As I walked past the glass-walled boardroom, I heard faint voices inside. I was about to keep walking when my name caught my ear. "She's just not as sharp as she used to be," one of the junior managers was saying. His tone was hushed, but not enough to keep me from hearing. Another voice, female, replied, "I mean, she's sweet, but the pace of this industry is brutal. We need people who can keep up." My hand tightened around the folder I was carrying. They were talking about me. I stood frozen for a moment, torn between stepping in and pretending I hadn't heard a thing. In the end, I walked past, my heels clicking a little louder than necessary. Inside, my chest felt tight. I knew whispers happened in every workplace, but hearing them so clearly was different. Later that day, I caught sight of Jacob and Anna through the glass of a cafe across the street. They were leaning toward each other, sharing a laugh over lunch. I remembered the countless times Jacob and I had sat there together, planning our next move for the company. Now I wasn't even invited. When he came home that night, Jacob mentioned he'd had a quick bite with a colleague. No names, no details. I didn't push. I just filed it away in my mind, another piece of a puzzle that was becoming harder to ignore. At the office, Anna's role continued to expand in ways that seemed almost invisible at first. She would suggest small changes during meetings, changes that, in effect, took responsibilities out of my hands. Maybe Jacob could handle client briefings from now on, she said one morning, smiling as if it were just a harmless idea. Or, I think the design team might respond better to someone with a fresher perspective. She never said I wasn't good enough outright. She didn't have to. Her words planted seeds, and I could see them taking root in the way others looked at me. It was subtle but effective, a gradual erosion of authority. One afternoon during a project review, I offered feedback on a presentation slide. Before I could finish, Anna interjected, "Oh, I already spoke to the team about that. We've decided to take a different direction." Jacob nodded in agreement without looking at me. The conversation moved on as if my input hadn't mattered at all. The strangest part was how Anna always managed to wrap her comments in politeness, as though she were doing me a favor. "I just thought it might free up your time, Marie," she would say, tilting her head in that sympathetic way. To the untrained eye, she seemed supportive, but I could feel the sharp edge beneath her words. I started noticing changes in how people approached me. Fewer emails landed in my inbox. Fewer updates came my way unless I specifically asked. It was as if I were slowly being removed from the loop. At home, Jacob seemed distracted, his attention flicking to his phone during dinner. Sometimes he smiled at messages he didn't share with me. When I asked about work, he gave vague answers, as though he didn't want to bore me with technical stuff. I told myself I wasn't going to jump to conclusions, but my instincts told me something was shifting, not just in the business, but in my marriage. Still, I played along. I attended meetings, even if my voice was drowned out. I smiled at Anna's suggestions as though I approved, and I kept my eyes open. Every small slight, every sidelong glance, every forgotten email, I stored them in my memory like files in a locked cabinet. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I passed by the boardroom again. Inside, Anna was talking to Jacob, her hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. She said something that made him laugh, a genuine, unguarded laugh I hadn't heard from him in weeks. For a brief moment, I stood there, watching them through the glass, unseen. I didn't feel rage, not yet. Instead, there was a cold clarity settling over me. They thought I was fading, that I would quietly step aside. What they didn't realize was that I was simply observing, letting them write their own downfall, one careless act at a time. Because if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was this: people who underestimate you never see you coming until it's too late. It was late afternoon when Jacob called me into his office. His tone was casual, almost friendly, but there was a certain stiffness in the way he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. I sat down, the sunlight from the tall window casting long shadows on the floor between us. "I've been thinking," he began, leaning back in his chair as though this was just another routine conversation. "You've been working so hard for years, Marie. Maybe it's time you took a step back, just for a while." I tilted my head, unsure what he meant. "A step back?" He nodded as if he were delivering good news. "Yes, you've been under a lot of stress. It's starting to affect you. I want you to focus on the bigger picture, on strategy, instead of day-to-day operations." My heart sank even before he finished the next sentence. "So, starting next month, Anna will be taking over most of your responsibilities. Client management, project approvals, some of the team oversight. You'll still have your title, of course, but this will free you from the pressure. Pressure. That was his word for the work I had built from the ground up, the work I had poured my life into. I smiled faintly because I knew my reaction would be studied. "If you think it's for the best," I said, keeping my voice steady. But inside, humiliation burned like acid. He looked relieved at my compliance, mistaking my calm for agreement. "Good. I knew you'd understand." He moved on quickly to discuss a charity gala we'd been invited to, as though the conversation we'd just had was nothing more than a casual rearrangement of schedules. That evening, I stayed in my office long after most employees had gone home. I stared at the framed photos on my desk. Snapshots from the early days of the company, back when Jacob and I were partners in every sense of the word. Now those days felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. The next week, the changes began. Emails meant for me were redirected to Anna. She took my seat at meetings, leading discussions with the ease of someone who knew she had the boss's backing. I became a spectator in rooms where I had once set the agenda. Anna played her role well. She made a point to be polite to me in public, greeting me with a cheerful "good morning" in the hallways, even as she quietly dismantled my position. She framed every takeover of my duties as a favor. "I thought I'd give you a break from this client," she'd say with a smile. "I know they can be demanding." The staff adjusted quickly. People who once sought my approval now went directly to Anna. The shift was subtle but complete, like watching the tide pull away from shore until the sand was bare. At home, Jacob acted as though nothing had changed. He still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still asked if I wanted tea at night. But now those moments felt hollow, as though we were actors playing a married couple whose script had grown thin. I wanted to confront him, to ask why he thought Anna could do my job better than I could, why he didn't even give me the chance to prove myself. But something in me knew that anger without evidence would only make me look insecure. And if there was one thing I refused to be, it was predictable. So I made a decision. I would not fight him now. I would not give Anna the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. Instead, I would observe. I would listen. And I would gather every scrap of proof I needed, not just to defend myself, but to turn the tables entirely. I started small. Copies of contracts, records of meetings, financial statements. I saved them all. I noted the dates Jacob spent working late with Anna, the projects she took over, the decisions she made without me. I kept my smile in place, letting them believe they had me exactly where they wanted me. Quiet, sidelined, and harmless. What they didn't realize was that I had learned something long ago. A move made too early is a move wasted. The most devastating strike comes when the other side thinks they've already won. And judging by the way Jacob and Anna were growing bolder with each passing day, they were convinced of their victory. That suited me just fine. The first rule I set for myself was simple: never let them know I was watching. On the surface, I was the same Marie, smiling politely in meetings, agreeing when Anna suggested small changes, and thanking Jacob when he reassured me I'd appreciate having less to worry about. But under that calm exterior, every day became a quiet hunt for proof. I began with the office server. Late at night, after most people had gone home, I logged into my account and downloaded copies of project files, contracts, and client communications. I transferred them to an encrypted drive I kept in my bag, along with physical printouts tucked between design portfolios that no one would bother to check. Emails were even more revealing. Buried between casual correspondence, I found threads where Anna discussed streamlining the leadership structure, always in ways that pushed me further to the sidelines. Sometimes Jacob replied with nothing more than a short "agreed." Other times, his messages were longer, praising her efficiency. I printed those too. The financial records took more effort. Jacob and I had always shared access to the company's main accounts, but I noticed certain files were no longer visible to me. That alone was a red flag. So, I requested monthly statements directly from our accountant under the guise of reviewing expense allocations. What I found was unsettling. Payments approved by Jacob that didn't match any official projects, and expense claims filed by Anna for client entertainment that seemed far too frequent and expensive. Outside of work, Anna's presence was becoming harder to ignore. She began accompanying Jacob to industry events, sometimes without even informing me until afterward. Social media was quick to fill in the gaps. Photos of them standing side by side, champagne in hand, smiling like the perfect professional duo. I noticed how Jacob's hand sometimes rested lightly at her back, a gesture that felt too familiar for colleagues. At home, subtle changes were happening too. Our joint savings account, which had always been stable, began showing large transfers into an account I didn't recognize. When I asked Jacob about it, he brushed it off with a vague explanation about investments and diversifying assets. He spoke with the easy tone of someone who expected me to take his word without question. I didn't press him. Instead, I quietly checked our other accounts, finding small but consistent withdrawals from our shared funds. They weren't large enough to raise suspicion to anyone but me, but I knew what they meant. He was moving money. Meanwhile, in the office, Anna had mastered the art of being indispensable. She lingered in Jacob's doorway for casual conversations, laughed at jokes I wasn't privy to, and even began using phrases I recognized from my own ideas, presenting them as her own in meetings. When others complimented her for innovative thinking, she graciously accepted without mentioning me. The most telling moment came one Thursday evening. I stayed late again, intending to collect a few more documents. As I stepped out of my office, I saw through the partially open blinds of Jacob's room. Anna sitting on the edge of his desk, her voice low, her body angled toward him. His expression was relaxed, even warm. They didn't notice me, and I didn't make a sound. I simply watched for a few seconds, then turned away. Every piece of evidence I gathered felt like another card in my hand. I wasn't ready to play them yet, but I could feel the weight of the deck growing. My advantage was that they thought I was out of the game entirely. They didn't see the late nights, the encrypted files, the way I kept track of dates, amounts, and names. I told myself that the day would come when I'd lay it all out. Not in anger, but with the precision of someone who had been preparing for the exact moment her enemies thought she was powerless. Until then, I kept my head down, my smile intact, and my eyes wide open, because the more they believed they were winning, the harder their fall would be. The annual company gala had always been my favorite event of the year. It was a chance to celebrate our milestones, thank our employees, and strengthen relationships with clients and investors. In the past, Jacob and I would stand together at the entrance, greeting guests as co-founders, a united front. This year felt different from the moment we arrived. Jacob walked slightly ahead of me, his pace brisk, his eyes scanning the crowd as though looking for someone. I followed, my smile in place, my dress carefully chosen, a deep navy that once would have earned his quiet compliment. Tonight, he didn't notice. The ballroom was a picture of elegance, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables dressed in white linen, the soft hum of conversation, the clink of champagne glasses. I spotted Anna almost instantly. She was in a sleek silver gown, standing near the center of the room with a small group of our top investors. When she saw Jacob, her face lit up. "Ah, here she is," Jacob said as he reached her side. For a fleeting second, I thought he meant me, but then he placed his hand on Anna's back and turned to the investors. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce the future face of our brand, Anna Foster." The words landed like a punch. I stood a few steps away, smiling mechanically as the investors nodded and shook her hand. Jacob continued speaking, outlining her fresh vision for the company, praising her innovative leadership, and recounting recent successes as though she had orchestrated them alone. My name wasn't mentioned once. I could feel the cameras clicking around us, the bright flashes freezing my forced expression in time. Somewhere, someone was recording this, and by tomorrow, the images would be circulating. When one of the investors finally noticed me and asked about my role, Jacob's response was casual, almost dismissive. "Oh, Marie's taking a well-deserved step back from operations. She's focusing on bigger picture ideas." His tone made it sound like I was a figurehead, a retired mascot. I excused myself soon after, retreating to the edge of the room where I could observe without being part of the scene. From there, I saw how Anna navigated the crowd with Jacob at her side, both of them laughing and clinking glasses. They looked every bit the power pair, except they weren't. Not truly. By the time the event ended, I had memorized every look, every gesture, every word that would later become part of my case against them. That night at home, Jacob acted as though nothing had happened. He loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and asked if I had enjoyed the evening. "You introduced Anna as the future face of the brand," I said evenly. "You didn't even mention me." He took a sip of his drink, his expression unreadable. "You're reading too much into it. It was just a figure of speech." "A figure of speech that was photographed and recorded?" I replied. "Do you know what that looks like to people?" He set his glass down a little too firmly. "It looks like I was acknowledging someone who's been doing great work for the company. You're being too sensitive, Marie. Always looking for problems where there aren't any." Gaslighting, I thought. A neat way to make me question my own perception, to make me doubt what I had seen with my own eyes. But I wasn't the same woman I had been months ago. I had evidence now. I had a plan. So I let him think his words had worked. I softened my voice, offered a small smile, and said, "Maybe you're right. Maybe I overreacted." He relaxed, satisfied. But behind my calm expression, the humiliation had hardened into something sharper, something that wouldn't fade with time. Tonight, they had tried to erase me in public. One day soon, I would return the favor. 2 days after the gala, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year, Laura Bennett, a close friend from college who had become one of the most respected corporate lawyers in the city. We met in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe, far from the places Jacob or Anna might frequent. She listened without interrupting as I laid everything out: the changes in my role, Anna's growing influence, the financial transfers, and the public snub at the gala. I slid a thick envelope across the table, copies of contracts, emails, and expense reports I had been collecting for months. Laura leafed through them, her expression sharpening with each page. "Marie," she said finally, lowering her voice, "you're in a much stronger position than you think. You're not just a co-founder. You hold 35% of the company's shares. That gives you significant voting power, especially if you align with the right board members." I sat back, absorbing her words. And the financial discrepancies? "They could be grounds for removal," she said, tapping one of Anna's expense reports. "If these were unauthorized or misrepresented, that's corporate misconduct. Jacob could face legal consequences for approving them." I felt a slow, steady spark of hope. This wasn't just about personal betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming what was mine, with the law on my side. Over the next weeks, I moved quietly. The first step was to secure my position financially. I sold a small investment property Jacob didn't know I still owned, transferring the proceeds into a private account under my sole control. I reduced my personal spending, keeping every transaction discreet. Then I began consolidating my shares. Some were tied up in joint arrangements with minor investors who, over the years, had grown distant from the company's operations. I reached out to them directly, offering fair prices to buy out their small holdings. Most agreed quickly, happy to cash out without fuss. Piece by piece, my influence in the company grew. At the same time, I worked on building alliances. I started with the people who had been there since the early days. Department heads who remembered the nights we stayed in the office until dawn to meet a deadline. The lunches we shared on folding chairs because the budget was too tight for anything else. I didn't speak ill of Jacob or Anna. Instead, I reminded them of our shared history, our original vision, and the values that had built the company. It was subtle, but effective. I could feel the shift in tone during meetings. People began seeking my opinion again, looping me into conversations they had once bypassed me in. Anna noticed. I caught her watching me once, her smile a little too tight, her eyes calculating. Jacob, on the other hand, seemed oblivious. He was confident in his belief that I had accepted my diminished role. He still left the house early with Anna for client breakfasts and returned late from networking events. I didn't challenge him. The longer he thought I was harmless, the better. By the end of the month, I had what I needed: solid legal grounds to challenge both Jacob's leadership and Anna's position, increase shareholding to strengthen my voting power, and quiet but steady support from key members of the company. One evening, I met Laura again. We sat in the same corner of the cafe, and I handed her a folder thicker than the last one. "I think we're ready," I said. She glanced through the contents, then looked up with a small, knowing smile. "They won't see this coming." "No," I agreed, feeling a calm certainty settle over me. And that's exactly the point. For months I had been pushed aside, underestimated, and treated as though I were a piece of the past. But the board meeting in 2 weeks would change everything. They had written me out of the picture. Now, I was going to paint myself back in, front and center. The buzz in the office was impossible to ignore. For weeks, Jacob and Anna had been preparing for what they called the biggest opportunity in the company's history, a major investor presentation that, if successful, would secure a multi-million-dollar partnership. Staff worked late, emails flew back and forth at all hours, and Anna seemed to live in Jacob's office. I watched it all unfold from my quieter corner, a place they had pushed me into months ago. I didn't ask questions or offer suggestions. In fact, when Jacob mentioned the upcoming presentation over dinner one night, I smiled and said, "I'll stay out of the way. This is your and Anna's moment." He looked relieved, as if I just cleared the last obstacle from his path. "That's probably for the best," he said, reaching for his phone before I could respond. What he didn't know was that I had already confirmed my legal rights with Laura. As a major shareholder and board member, I had every right to attend any presentation involving company strategy, especially one that could alter our ownership structure. There was no legal way for him to keep me out, not without exposing himself to scrutiny he couldn't afford. In the days leading up to the event, I focused on preparation of my own. I reviewed the presentation materials that passed through the shared server, noting discrepancies between projected figures and actual data from our records. I double-checked the expense reports that would be shown to investors, highlighting several client-related costs that were clearly personal in nature. I also reached out discreetly to 2 board members who had been showing signs of unease with Jacob's leadership. Over coffee and casual conversation, I reminded them of the company's founding values, its transparency and accountability, values we were at risk of losing. I didn't accuse Jacob or Anna directly. I didn't need to. The numbers would speak for themselves soon enough. Meanwhile, Anna was everywhere, leading rehearsals, sending out schedules, and arranging private dinners with select investors. She carried herself like she was already in charge, and Jacob encouraged it, letting her present more and more of their joint material. I caught snippets of conversations in the hallway, where she referred to herself as the face of the company, without a trace of hesitation. 2 nights before the presentation, I stayed late at the office, making copies of every key document I had collected over the past months. I placed them in a sleek leather folder, organized, tabbed, and ready to be handed over at the perfect moment. The morning of the event, I dressed with deliberate care. A tailored black dress, understated jewelry, and my hair swept back in a style that said I was here on business, not sentiment. When I arrived at the venue, a sleek conference center in the heart of the city, Jacob's surprise was almost comical. "I didn't expect you here," he said, his smile tight. "As a board member, I thought it was important to attend," I replied smoothly. "Don't worry, I'll just observe." Anna's expression flickered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Of course, the more support, the better," she said brightly, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. The investors began arriving, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. Jacob and Anna worked the room together, their energy polished and rehearsed. I kept my distance, chatting with a few longtime associates who still remembered me as the co-founder, not just the sidelined wife. When the presentation began, I took a seat near the front, my folder resting on my lap. Jacob opened with confident remarks, followed by Anna's smooth transition into market projections and brand positioning. The investors nodded along, impressed by the numbers. Numbers I knew were selectively presented. I waited, calm and patient, because I knew my moment was coming. This was their stage today, but in just a little while, the spotlight would shift. And when it did, the story they'd been telling would unravel completely. on their biggest day in front of the people whose opinions mattered most. The conference room was filled with a sharp hum of anticipation as Jacob wrapped up his pitch. His voice carried confidence, and Anna stood beside him like a polished co-star, clicking through the final slides. The investors seemed engaged, nodding along to projections and growth charts. I waited until Jacob smiled and said, "At this point, we're happy to take any questions." That was my cue. I rose from my seat, my leather folder in hand, and walked to the front. The movement drew every eye in the room. Jacob's expression flickered, confusion, then irritation, but he didn't speak. "Before we move forward," I said evenly, "there are some details the board and our potential investors need to be aware of. As a co-founder, major shareholder, and board member, I have a responsibility to ensure transparency." I placed the folder on the table, opening it with slow precision. Beside me, Laura, my lawyer, set down her briefcase, her presence a silent but undeniable statement. "This," I continued, pulling out the first document, "is a record of company funds misappropriated over the past 6 months. Several transactions were labeled as client entertainment or market research, but in fact covered personal dinners, travel, and other non-business expenses." I slid copies across the table toward the investors. One of them adjusted his glasses, scanning the highlighted sections. "These were approved by you, Jacob?" Jacob shifted uncomfortably. "They were necessary for building relationships." I cut in, my tone still calm. "Necessary? One of these relationship-building trips coincided with a personal weekend getaway for Jacob and Anna at a resort in Napa Valley, paid for entirely with company funds." Murmurs spread through the room. Anna's composure cracked for the first time, her hand tightening on the edge of the podium. I moved to the next set of papers. "Here, you'll see repeated instances of interference in operational decisions. Emails from Ms. Foster overriding project directions without board approval, including the removal of myself, a co-founder, from critical client negotiations. This not only breaches protocol, but jeopardizes contractual obligations." An investor who had been quiet until now leaned forward. "This is serious. These actions could undermine the company's credibility." Anna finally spoke, her voice sharp. "This is being taken out of context. My role was to improve efficiency." "By sidelining the founder?" Laura interjected, her voice firm but controlled. "By redirecting company resources for personal benefit? These are not efficiencies. These are liabilities." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Where there had been polite interest, there was now scrutiny, directed entirely at Jacob and Anna. I didn't need to raise my voice. The document spoke louder than I ever could. One investor closed the folder in front of him and looked straight at Jacob. "If this is accurate, your leadership is in question." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was its own confession. I gathered the remaining documents into a neat stack. Our company was built on integrity and transparency. If we lose those, no amount of projected growth will save us. I am prepared to take the necessary steps to restore those values. I didn't say the words outright, but everyone in the room understood. Jacob's position was no longer secure. Anna's role was untenable. When the meeting adjourned, the investors left in hushed conversations, folders under their arms. Jacob avoided my gaze, his shoulders stiff. Anna walked out quickly, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her head slightly bowed. Laura leaned toward me as we gathered our things. "That," she whispered, "was a clean break of their facade. It won't recover." I straightened my dress, the weight of months of preparation lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in a long while, I felt the balance of power shift entirely back into my hands. They had tried to erase me from my own story. Now, in front of the people whose opinions mattered most, I had written myself back in and written them out. The board meeting to determine Jacob's future was set for the following week. I arrived early, calm and composed, my documents in perfect order. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. The investors and board members who had witnessed the unmasking were now here to decide the company's next step. Jacob walked in minutes later, looking drawn but still trying to carry himself with authority. Anna followed, her expression stiff, her movements cautious. She avoided my eyes completely. Once everyone was seated, the chairman invited me to speak first. I stood, resting my hands lightly on the table. As a co-founder and significant shareholder, I believe it's my duty to ensure the company's long-term stability and protect it from actions that threaten its integrity. The evidence presented last week has made it clear that current leadership decisions have damaged both our reputation and operational trust. I paused, letting the silence work for me. Therefore, I move that Jacob Richards be removed from his role as CEO, effective immediately, and that Anna Foster's employment be terminated due to breach of protocol and misuse of company resources. Gasps rippled through the room. One of the board members I had met with privately cleared his throat. I second the motion. The vote was swift. With the allies I had quietly secured and the shares I had consolidated, the outcome was inevitable. When the final tally was read aloud, Jacob's removal was confirmed and Anna's termination approved. Anna's face drained of color. She gathered her belongings without a word, her silver bracelet jingling faintly as she stood. She didn't look back as she left the room. Jacob remained seated, his knuckles white against the table. "Marie," he began, his voice low, "can we speak in private?" I met his eyes for the first time in weeks. "There's nothing left to discuss," I said evenly. Then, after a beat, I added, "You downgraded the wrong person." He flinched, the meaning sinking in. Without another word, I turned to the board. "I will remain as controlling shareholder and will work with the board to appoint a CEO who upholds the values we were founded on. My priority is the company, not personal grievances." The meeting concluded with formalities, but I felt the shift in the room. People looked at me differently now, with respect instead of pity. As I walked out, my steps were measured, steady. This wasn't about gloating. It was about reclaiming what had been mine all along. In the hallway, a few employees stood watching, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. I nodded politely and kept walking. The echo of my heels a steady rhythm against the polished floor. Outside, the winter air was crisp, the city alive with movement. I breathed it in, feeling lighter than I had in months. My phone buzzed, Laura's message, "Congratulations. They won't recover from this." I allowed myself a small smile. No, they wouldn't. Not professionally, and not in the eyes of the people who mattered. I hailed a cab, sliding into the back seat as the driver asked for my destination. "Home," I said simply, but I knew I was going somewhere far beyond that. 3 months passed, and the company felt entirely different. The tense atmosphere that had hung over the office for so long had lifted. With Jacob gone and a new CEO, a seasoned professional with a genuine respect for the founding vision, at the helm, teams worked with renewed energy. Meetings were purposeful, communication flowed openly, and for the first time in years, the work felt inspiring again. I no longer had to watch my back in my own company. The people around me weren't just colleagues, they were partners in a shared goal. Many of them had been with us since the beginning, and their loyalty now showed in ways big and small. Extra hours volunteered, candid feedback offered, and a level of trust I hadn't felt in years. Outside of work, my life had opened up in ways I hadn't expected. I started accepting invitations I used to decline, dinners with friends, weekend trips, even a cooking class just for the fun of it. I traveled for pleasure instead of business, spending a week in Florence, wandering through art galleries, sipping espresso in quiet piazzas, and remembering what it felt like to live without a constant weight on my chest. The more distance I had from Jacob's betrayal, the more I saw it for what it was. Not the end of something precious, but the removal of something toxic. There was no longing, no curiosity about how he was doing, just relief that my life no longer revolved around trying to prove my worth to someone who had already decided to undervalue it. One chilly Saturday morning, I ducked into a small cafe near the park to meet an old friend. The place was warm, the air rich with the scent of fresh pastries. We took a table by the window, and within minutes we were laughing over some ridiculous memory from our university days. That was when I saw him. Jacob standing near the counter, a paper cup in his hand. For a moment, he didn't notice me. Then his gaze drifted across the room and our eyes met. I didn't look a winch. He froze for just a beat, and in that brief silence, I saw it, the recognition, the realization. I was different now. My laughter wasn't forced, my smile wasn't a mask. I was surrounded by warmth and ease, not by the brittle tension that had defined the final months of our marriage. I gave him a polite nod, nothing more. Then I turned back to my friend, letting the conversation flow without missing a beat. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him linger for a moment longer before walking out into the street. I wondered if he was thinking about that night at the gala, or the moment in the boardroom when I told him he'd downgraded the wrong person. Maybe he was finally piecing together what I had known all along, that I was never someone to be walked over, and that his mistake wasn't just in underestimating me, but in thinking I needed him at all. By the time my cappuccino arrived, the thought had already faded. Jacob was the past, and I had no reason to look back. Later that day, as I walked home through the crisp winter air, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. My life wasn't perfect, no one's ever is, but it was mine, wholly and completely. And that, I realized, was the sweetest kind of victory.